We're at the COP21 in Marrakesh, an important meeting on climate change after the Paris meeting. We are here live on three television stations, France24, RFI, and TV5 Monde, with Roselyne Febvre for France24, Christophe Boisbouvier for RFI, and Patrick Simonia for TV5 One. Mr. President, this is a very important occasion, and since the last climate change agreement, we have had a new presidential election in the United States. Yes, following the election of Donald Trump, he said that this is now a period of uncertainty. Isn't it worse than that? Isn't it really a period of serious concern? I think that you spoke to Donald Trump on the telephone last week. What was the conversation like? Did you find it reassuring? When you hung up the phone, what was your impression?
First of all, Donald Trump has been elected. It's a fact. It was the will of the American people. We respect the choice of the Americans. Donald Trump had positions during the campaign which have disturbed people. This is true, including on the issue of the climate. The phone call I had with him was intended to appease what needed to be appeased. He himself was in an attitude of wanting to have a dialogue, and France has a long-standing friendship with the United States and wants to have cooperation with America. We have so many subjects in common, and on the basis of the interest of France, of Europe, of the United States, and of our common values. And with Donald Trump, we have agreed that we should continue the conversation, and it will take place once he has taken on his responsibilities in January. There was one specific point that we discussed, that is that fighting terrorism should be our shared objective. From that point of view, the United States have always been the allies and our partners, and that will continue. Now, on the climate, that was the topic of the discussion we had today in Marrakesh. In the speech that I gave here, the Paris Agreement that I wanted to be signed. You remember what happened. All of the heads of government are there. The future of the planet has to be decided. We want to avoid global warming. And the Paris Agreement is irreversible. And this is what I wanted to indicate very clearly here in Marrakesh.
So indeed, you have spoken with Donald Trump. He is a climate change denier. He has said that he will cancel the Paris Agreement. If tomorrow the world's second largest polluter decides to increase the use of coal and to cut back on renewables, then what will happen to the Paris Agreement?
The Paris Agreement is irreversible from a legal point of view. It has been ratified by the United States. If the United States wanted to withdraw from the agreement, it would be a very long process. But the United States may decide to not abide by their own commitment. That would be unfavorable for the planet. And the United States are one of the greatest, probably the greatest producer of greenhouse gases. It would be bad for the United States. The planet is not organized with borders and barbed wires and frontiers. And everyone is concerned when we're dealing with the climate. A lot of countries are involved in the environmental transition and ecological transition. Many organizations have mobilized themselves in the United States. The United States is a federal country. What does this mean? There are states, California, Michigan, Oregon. There are many different states, and the states themselves have put themselves in the prospect of the climate agreement. So I believe that Donald Trump will be making decisions which won't necessarily be the ones that he announced during his campaign. And if he didn't make decisions, he would be running risk himself, because the products would seem to be going against the interest of the planet. If he cannot trade with the rest of the planet as he does today, the first victims would be the American companies.
He said that the Chinese invented climate change. This is something that he said during the campaign. You think it's over now?
I would have great difficulty in doing that. But it is clear that there is what people say in a campaign, and he now will have a responsibility.
You think he might improve?
I think that the movement has started, and it will not stop. It has started even in his own country and in the world. You mentioned the Chinese. The Chinese are the greatest producers of greenhouse gases. There was the discussion between Barack Obama and the Chinese president and ourselves for the Chinese to take part in the agreement. And we weren't sure of that. And the Chinese will say, well, if the United States don't go to the end of their commitment, maybe we will pull out, because pollution is in China, and it's very serious. The Chinese also wish to fight global warming.
Barack Obama promised $3 billion a year for the countries of the South. You think that Donald Trump will honor that promise?
I don't know about this, but what I can tell you is that France and Europe will go even further than the commitments that they have planned. France has a responsibility. France is here. The United States may decide of their future through a new president. We will have our own elections, but France is capable of making decisions on its own for its defense, to fight against global warming, to act against terrorism, to be present in Africa or in the Middle East, where we are called. And we, with respect to the financial agreements that were taken, we will go even further. And we will go even further for the uncarbonated part, to reduce the share of carbon in our economy. And Europe also has a choice to make. Should Europe remain quiet in the light of what is happening, or should it make decisions for its security, its defense, fighting global warming? Europe will take its responsibility. France and Germany will be taking initiatives.
Excuse me, Mr. President, but when we look at what Trump has said about NATO, we see his relationship with Russia. We see that, with regard to Ukraine or the Baltic nations, Vladimir Putin may have a free hand. We're worried about the future of Europe.
The United States, which will be presided over by Donald Trump in the future, are an eminent member of the Atlantic Alliance. I have no doubt about that. The United States will remain in this alliance and in this common security. And I believe that there are concerns, and it is up to Donald Trump to eliminate these worries. You mentioned Vladimir Putin. He's right. From that point of view, there is no real change. And I myself speak to Vladimir Putin and with Mrs. Merkel, and we have spent days and sometimes nights talking about Ukraine and Syria, because we must speak to Vladimir Putin. I cannot say here that one should not speak to Vladimir Putin. We need to know what our interest is. We have common interests with Russia, seeking solutions to pull out of the conflict in Syria, to ensure that the Minsk agreements that were negotiated with President Poroshenko for Ukraine can be applied. We have a common interest, which is fighting terrorism. So it is in our interest to have discussions. And it would be a mistake to think that one should give in to Putin. But why would we do that? Or we should not consider that he shouldn't be a partner. He must be a partner where solutions need to be defined in common.
Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin are strong leaders, authoritarian, nationalistic. Do you think that Trump is sort of giving a gift to Putin? I mean, do you think that he might lift the trade sanctions that have been on Russia since the annexation of Crimea? Do you think that there might be a big shift in alliances?
For that, too, you will ask Donald Trump. I have asked him the question. You asked him the question. He didn't answer anything for the time being. He is not in a position to answer this. He has just been elected, and there's a transition phase. But I will tell you what the position of France is. If the Minsk agreements are fully implemented, the sanctions will be lifted. If there are obstacles coming from Russia, if there are barriers, then the sanctions will be continued. That is the position of France and the position of Europe, and that is the proper position. Sanctions are not eternal. They aim at promoting a process. And this is where I return to the autonomy and the independence of France and the role of Europe. Of course, we have a link with the United States. Of course, we wish to work with the United States, presided by Donald Trump a few weeks from now. I don't choose. I deal with the leaders who have been elected democratically, and sometimes those who have not even been elected democratically. But Donald Trump was elected democratically. The United States is an ally of France. It's the #1 economy in the world. That we should have questions. Yes, there are questions, and these questions must be lifted. Questions on the climate agreement, questions regarding the agreement with Iran, questions as to the position vis-à-vis Vladimir Putin and vis-à-vis Ukraine, questions regarding Syria. How do we find a solution? Questions also concerning fighting terrorism, even though on that point I'm convinced that we will find a solution, and there are values that we should promote together.
Indeed, with regard to Europe. In reality, France isn't even 2%, doesn't even spend 2% of GDP on defense. If Donald Trump were to withdraw from NATO, I think it would be a real panic in Europe, no?
Well, first of all, France is the country in Europe which spends the most for its defense with the United Kingdom. And during my term, since 2012, I have increased the allocation for defense. There had never been a programming law for the budget of defense that had been respected before I became president. Not only was it respected, but it was even increased, not as a matter of principle, but due to a principle, a higher principle, which is reality. I could not engage in external operations as I've done in a number of countries and ask the army to engage in the Sentinel operation to protect our territory without increasing the funding of our defense. France is doing more than its duty and will continue to do so. We have the objective, which is 2% of the national wealth devoted to defense. Europe is not doing enough.
Germany gives more?
Germany and other countries, and with our German friends, this is a question that we have discussed very clearly. And Germany has assured us that it will be doing more, but we should do more than provide resources. What we need now is for Europe to be able to ensure its security.
But will Trump's election change something?
Security of the borders, security in fighting terrorism, security vis-à-vis threats which may come from the outside, and also interventions in a number of areas where there is a danger or a threat, which France has done, in particular in Mali. Whoever the president-elect may have been in November, and including if it had been Hillary Clinton, Europe was facing its responsibilities. And I had warned all of my European colleagues, I said, whoever the president-elect may be, you will need to ensure your defense with the United States, in connection with the United States, because they are our allies. But there cannot be a continent which can protect its citizens if it does not ensure its own defense, and if it is not capable of expressing a political message which sometimes requires force.
Mr. President, the fight against terrorism. When we have Trump and Putin working hand in hand, it seems, do you think they will unite to fight on the side of Assad? And in Syria, will there be a clash between Daesh and Assad?
That's a risk. I've always said so. If the Russians think, with others perhaps today, that it is by keeping Bashar al-Assad forever that they will find a solution to the crisis, the war, the massacre in Syria, those people are mistaken. The challenge is to fight Daesh and Islamic terrorism. But the regime is also using Islamic terrorism to perpetuate itself. So we must fight Daesh, and this is what we're doing. Right now, there are French aircraft which are taking off and striking Iraq and Syria. And we have forces on our aircraft carrier. We have rocket bases which are close to Mosul in Iraq to reconquer Mosul. And we are taking our responsibilities. And in Syria, if there isn't a political solution which can include all of the parties, I'm not talking about the Islamists who are fighting us. I'm talking about the opponents who are moderate opponents and who, in fact, started the revolution and who are being bombed, in particular in Aleppo. And this is what is happening right now. And we must find a political solution in Syria.
Mr. President, there's Raqqa, there's Mosul. You mentioned that. And there are jihadists who are French nationals who may return to France. This is a threat that we could predict. How many people do you think could be returning to France to carry out jihad on our territory?
What are the numbers, since you're asking the question? There are approximately 600 French citizens or persons who previously resided in France who are in Syria or Iraq amongst the jihadists, amongst the terrorists. There are approximately 220 French jihadists or persons who previously resided in France who have been killed. And there are those amongst those 600 who may be returning. Every time one of them, man or woman, because they're women also, or children, every time they come back, they are arrested. And legal proceedings are engaged against them.
What about the state of emergency?
This is not a matter of state of emergency. What do we need to do? Thanks to the cooperation of the intelligence services, we're able to arrest all those who are coming back.
Can you affirm, Mr. President, that the security of our borders is being ensured?
We say that every time we can identify someone, and this is most often the case, there are women who returned these past days, young women who had been taken over there with their spouse. They returned and were immediately put in the hands of our judicial system. Regarding the refugees, why do we systematically carry out verifications? Why was France determined to have border checks? You saw what happened in the flow of refugees in 2015. So we ensured that Europe would be able to control the flows of refugees. I'm not saying that there will never be any, but we're taking measures. The state of emergency, yes. The state of emergency, as long as the threat exists. And you just mentioned it. What is the threat? Right now, we are at war. We are striking the Islamist terrorists in Iraq and Syria, and also in Mali, since we have a force in the Sahel region. And we ourselves are very regularly faced with individuals who want to attack us here on our territory. And I pay tribute to the work of our Home Affairs Minister and all of our services who fight this. We are not advertising this, but this is happening. As long as the threat exists, as long as we need measures which are exceptional, and there will be these coming weeks, a presidential election, there will be gatherings. The government has proposed to extend the state of emergency, and this will be proposed to the parliament. And I wish to extend the state of emergency until the presidential election.
Let's say a little bit more about Donald Trump's declarations. He's also talked about reversing the nuclear agreement with Iran. Mr. President, what if the United States decided to renegotiate this agreement? Trump had said it was the stupidest, the worst agreement in history. It seems like a paradox, because he's quite indulgent with Bashar al-Assad's regime.
France, among the negotiators, was the country which was the most demanding and the most determined regarding the verifications. It's not just a matter of having an agreement so that Iran doesn't have the nuclear weapon. We have to ensure this during the whole of the process. France, and I wish to thank the whole Fabius, who was the French negotiator. It's not that we had a hard time in the negotiation, but not everyone shared our position, but in the end, it was shared. So this agreement gives us assurances that we will be able to do this. And the United States would be calling into question this agreement with Donald Trump.
He said he wanted to tear it up.
I don't want to go back to what he may have said during the campaign, but there is a principle of reality. This agreement gives us guarantees. The absence of an agreement would be worse. An agreement which could be torn up by one of the parties. Does this mean that Iran could continue its research, its development? And the security of the whole region and ours is that the agreement with Iran must be confirmed. Well, it doesn't even need to be confirmed. The agreement exists. For the time being, there has been no discussion. I can answer that. I have had no discussion on the substance with Donald Trump, because he himself has said that he is open to working together. But he would be making those decisions only once he has his teams and his administration is organized.
Well, what about treaties that have already been signed? He's talked about renouncing them.
It's up to him to say.
Is he unpredictable, in fact?
I've understood in the conversation that I had, which didn't last more than 10 minutes, I understood that he was in a phase of appeasement and seeking to work in common with his partners and setting up a team as solid as possible around him. And also, I will say something that you know. The President of the United States does not decide alone. There is a Congress. There is a House of Representatives. There is a Senate. And those representatives have objectives which are not necessarily those that Donald Trump may have mentioned during his campaign.
An important question about Africa. President Kabila in the Democratic Republic of Congo would like to continue his mandate, and there have been demonstrations, repression of the demonstrations. 53 were killed, and the UN radio and RFI radio signals were blocked in the country.
Every time the freedom of information is called into question is a subject of concern for France. We have said so. Regarding the Democratic Republic of Congo, there's a constitution. It has to be respected. There's an end of a mandate. It has to be respected.
Mr. President, all of this seems to point to a rising populism. Mrs. Le Pen was the first European leader to congratulate Donald Trump. Do you think that populism will strike France?
Well, I seem to have understood that she had hoped for the victory of Trump. But I think one should try and understand what happened in the United States, just as what happened in the United Kingdom with the Brexit. There is a temptation which is protectionist and isolationist in a number of countries. And that is happening not in just any country. In the United States, the number one economic power in the world, which is regarded as the continent which is drawing the greatest amount of benefits from globalization. The UK, of whom we were told that the economy was dynamic with a blooming city, in a way has also chosen isolationism by leaving Europe. So the temptation exists in all of the countries in Europe or developed countries. It exists in France. I know it. I see that there are a number of political families. You mentioned one, the National Front, the extreme right, who would want the French to withdraw, to close themselves up to the outside world. I'm not saying that one shouldn't control our borders and that regarding globalization that we should be naive or innocent, which would be a form of irresponsibility and powerlessness. But what is important is we must provide a future for our country which not be closed, but we need to open up based on our forces because it is in our interest, in the interest of France, to be able to play our role in the world and to have our companies gaining markets and exporting throughout the world and have investments coming into our country and be the best. And we are the best in many areas in the field of technology. Our culture should be carried out through the world. And I refuse the solution of protectionism and rejection of the other. And I think we should further strengthen our excellence in production. And that is the reason why I took the decisions on the Responsibility Pact support to companies, innovation, and research, because that's the most important thing. I don't want a weak economy. When we have a weak economy, you can't have a strong diplomacy.
Mr. President, Emmanuel Macron has announced that he will announce his candidacy tomorrow. Does this make you want to run for president more or less? And do you think there's room in politics for so many candidates?
I will not comment on this. I will tell you what I feel right now, at this moment, regarding the situations that we have talked about, the threats and the dangers we may be running. The challenge is
and
coming
the left
together.
Is divided.
If it is not united,
who can unite the left?
It will not work. My responsibility as President of the Republic is, and I'm speaking as the President of the Republic, not in another position. I speak as the President of the Republic. Cohesion will be the essential element. If France divides itself, if France fragments itself, if France disunites itself at a moment when it has to face so many threats and when it has so many assets and so much such a role to play as we're doing here.
But what about the combat that you have to fight?
What counts is not my person. It's the country and being together.
Before we wrap up, one more question, very important. 3 years ago today, Ghislaine Dupont and Claude Verlon, our colleagues, journalists, were assassinated in Mali. And in your book, in the book written about you by two reporters, you said that the hostage takers were the same who had kidnapped Philippe Verdon sometime earlier. Does that mean that the secret services didn't do their job, that our services were not optimal?
All of the information that we may have through our intelligence services are passed on to the judiciary systems. I've also said one thing. Every time our citizens are attacked, every time our soldiers are attacked, are targeted, and this is the case again in Mali, we look for the culprits and we ensure that they are neutralized.
Thank you, Mr. President, for this live interview. France24, TV5 Monde, and RFI.
There you've seen it, the French President François Hollande, his first sit-down interview since Donald Trump's election, speaking to France24's Roselyne Fèvre, Christophe Boisbouvier of Radio France International, and our colleague there from TV5. The French President who said the